Stephen Bonzo. Daniel was never meant to be a soldier. He was born to be a king. Eddie Lyons was never meant to share a throne. He was born to take one. When these two ruthless men collided on the blood-soaked streets of Glasgow, the city became a war zone, and only one name would survive the smoke: Stephen Bonzo. Daniel came into the world carrying a name already drenched in criminal legacy. Born into the feared Daniel family in the north of Glasgow, Bonzo's fate was shaped by bloodlines long before he understood what power meant. His uncles and cousins were household names in the underworld, whispered about in housing schemes and prison yards alike. Their reign over Glasgow's drug routes and protection rackets was not only feared but also oddly respected. From a young age, Bonzo witnessed a world that moved differently. Where others went to school, he watched cash change hands in pub backrooms. Where others played football, he sat in on silent meetings held in unmarked vans. There was never a question of whether Bonzo would get involved. The only question was when. Unlike some of his older relatives, Bonzo wasn't reckless or loud. He was a watcher. He listened more than he spoke, studied mistakes others made, and picked his battles. When he turned 18, instead of taking up a weapon or dealing openly in the street like so many eager young men before him, Bonzo chose a different route. He started small, buying a failing car wash in Mary Hill and turning it into a front for laundering money. Within 2 years, he expanded into clubs, gyms, and private garages. All clean on paper but dirty beneath. What separated him from his predecessors was precision. He wasn't just a thug, he was a strategist. By the time he was 25, Bonzo had become the quiet engine behind the Daniel Empire's second wave. He forged new links to Eastern European traffickers, modernized operations with encrypted phones and coded drop-offs, and avoided the kind of public violence that brought heat from the police. The drug trade shifted under his influence, more discreet, more professional, and far more profitable. But with expansion came threat. Across the city, another name was growing louder: the Lyons family. They had come up fast and brutal, carving out their own section of Glasgow from Tollcross to Carntine. Led by Eddie Lyons, a brutal man with a chip on his shoulder, and his younger brother Declan, the Lyons crew thrived on chaos. Where Bonzo used silence, they used fear. Where he moved in the shadows, they dragged their rivals into daylight and humiliated them. For a while, an unspoken balance held. The Daniel family controlled the north and west, the Lyons had the east. But it couldn't last. Power doesn't settle quietly. The first crack came when a convoy of Daniel-linked vehicles transporting cocaine was intercepted and stripped clean on the M8. No violence, no bodies, just precision and humiliation. It was a message, and Bonzo received it clearly. He responded the only way he knew how, with strategy. Within weeks, one of the Lyons' key cash laundering spots, a used car dealership in Parkhead, went up in flames. There were no arrests, just rumors. Shortly after, Declan Lyons survived a drive by shooting that left 3 bullet holes in the passenger door of his BMW. Bonzo never claimed responsibility, but the message was clear. Glasgow had become a chessboard, and the first pawns had fallen. But this wasn't going to be a short conflict. Both families were embedded into the city's structure, with years of alliances, debts, and silent witnesses keeping the gears turning. The police knew something was building, but couldn't see where the hammer would fall. In the background, Bonzo prepared for a different kind of war, one fought not just on the streets but in silence, through betrayal, surveillance, and a growing sense that no one, not even family, could be trusted. Glasgow, for all its resilience, was about to bleed. Bonzo's retaliation after the M8 hijacking was swift, but it wasn't loud. He didn't crave headlines. He wanted fear. A garage in Parkhead known for laundering Lyons' drug money was engulfed in flames just days after the hijack. No fingerprints, no witnesses. The fire brigade couldn't trace the cause, and no one claimed responsibility. But everyone knew. In Glasgow's criminal underworld, Silence often said more than words ever could. Then came the attempted hit on Lyons. Outside a gym he frequented, a black SUV rolled up and sprayed bullets into his car. He lived only because he was in the changing room at the time. His BMW, however, told the story. Bonzo had drawn bloodlines through the city. Declan, enraged and impulsive, wanted to retaliate immediately. But Eddie Lyons, older and more calculated, held him back. He knew Bonzo didn't make mistakes. If they moved too soon, they'd lose more than they gained. Instead, they needed someone who could match Bonzo's intelligence with savagery. That man was Calvin Muir. Calvin wasn't a typical enforcer. A former cage fighter with a history of violence, he had a reputation for handling problems with zero hesitation. He had no family ties, no loyalty to anyone but the highest bidder, and a prison record that spoke volumes. Eddie recruited him for one reason: track Bonzo, wait for the crack in his armor, and end it. For weeks, Calvin followed Bonzo's movements. The gangster had become more cautious since the M8 incident, changing cars, altering routines, sometimes disappearing for days. But even careful men get comfortable. Calvin noticed a pattern. Every Thursday night, Bonzo would visit a discreet flat near Royston, always with minimal security. It wasn't business. It was family. Bonzo's cousin had just had a baby, and he made time for them weekly, a rare soft spot in an otherwise hardened man. The trap was set on a cold Thursday night in April. As Bonzo left the gathering and slid into the back of a black Range Rover, 3 motorbikes approached from the shadows. Each rider wore a helmet, each carried a weapon. They moved quickly, boxing in the vehicle, and within seconds unleashed a hail of bullets. The driver, Frankie Boyd, was killed instantly, the windshield shattered, and Bonzo, caught in the chaos, took a round to the skull and another to the shoulder. Blood covered the seats, and yet, somehow, he survived. The city erupted in whispers. The attack was one of the boldest in recent history. Bonzo had been touched, something no one thought possible. Rumors spread like wildfire. That he was brain dead, that he'd fled to Ireland, that his family was plotting retribution in secret. The police clamped down hard, but arrests were few and information scarce. The attackers vanished as if they'd never existed. What followed was silence, the kind that hangs heavy over a city when something terrible has happened but no one dares speak of it. Bonzo disappeared from Glasgow entirely. His clubs were shuttered. His lieutenants either fled or went underground. For the first time in over a decade, the Daniel name was no longer a shield. Without its leader, the empire began to splinter. Smaller gangs began carving out pieces of territory. Debt collectors refused to pay cuts. Drug shipments slowed. But something about the silence felt wrong. Bonzo had always been more than muscle. He was methodical, patient. He didn't move unless the move mattered. And so, while his enemies celebrated what they saw as a victory, others who had known him longer warned against counting him out. Because if Bonzo was still breathing, he wasn't retreating. He was planning. And when men like him plan, cities fall quietly. Bonzo's sudden disappearance after the ambush sent shockwaves through the criminal underworld. His enemies celebrated, believing the ghost of Stephen Daniel had finally been laid to rest, if not in body, then in spirit. But others, especially those who knew him well, weren't so sure. Bonzo didn't vanish, he recalculated. While the city was on edge, watching for a counterattack that never came, he was somewhere in the shadows, healing, observing, and waiting. Whispers about his survival were everywhere. Some claimed he had fled to Ireland under a new identity, protected by an old associate with IRA connections. Others swore he was recovering in a fortified safe house in the Highlands, guarded by ex-soldiers loyal only to the Daniels. The truth, however, was stranger than the rumors. Bonzo was closer than anyone expected. Hiding in plain sight, tucked into the edges of Glasgow's forgotten streets. He had changed his appearance. Discarded the tailored suits for hoodies and jeans, and drove around in a beat-up Ford instead of luxury sedans. The once feared kingpin had become a phantom in his own city. But time away from the throne came at a cost. His absence left a vacuum. The Daniel operation, once seamless under Bonzo's guidance, became fractured. Power-hungry subordinates began carving their own paths. Two of his former lieutenants turned on each other over a heroin route in Maryhill, resulting in a double stabbing that drew media attention. The police, long frustrated by the silence surrounding Daniel crimes, sensed weakness and started arresting lower-level players, flipping whoever they could. The once fearsome empire was bleeding from within. Across the city, the Lyons family was gaining ground. With Bonzo presumed out of the game, Eddie Lyons expanded rapidly. His men took over pubs once under Daniel control. Drug prices were raised, debts were called in aggressively, and old Daniel allies were given ultimatums: switch sides or disappear. Some resisted, but many folded. Fear had changed hands. Even Bonzo's closest cousin, Kieran Daniel, was struggling to maintain loyalty among his own crew. Tensions reached a boiling point when a former Daniel runner was found tortured and dumped outside a housing estate with a Lyons symbol carved into his chest. Bonzo, still watching from the shadows, knew this couldn't go unanswered. But striking without exposing himself would be a risk. He needed leverage. That leverage came in the form of a cracked phone belonging to a Lyons dealer, stolen during a bar fight in Drumchapel. The messages inside revealed the location of a planned kidnappings. Kieran Daniel was the target. The plan was brutal: snatch him, beat him for information, and leave him as a message. Bonzo acted fast. Without alerting police or using his fractured network, he sent a silent warning through a trusted courier. Kieran changed his routine, and when the attackers arrived at the planned location, they were ambushed instead. Two were captured and severely beaten. One of them, a 22-year-old named Ross Tierney, died 2 days later from internal injuries. The other vanished, presumed dead, though no body was ever found. The incident shifted the tone of the war. Bonzo had sent a clear message without ever being seen. He was still in the game, still pulling strings. But now, the war wasn't just about turf or drugs. It was personal. Families were being targeted. Old codes were broken. The rules that had once kept violence contained to certain hours or places no longer applied. Glasgow was becoming a battlefield without borders. And yet, Bonzo remained a ghost, hunted, but never caught. The city could feel his presence even if no one could prove it. Every act of violence, every silence after an attack, raised the same question: is Bonzo still out there watching? The answer, though unspoken, hung heavy in the air. Yes. Nearly a year after the ambush that almost killed him, Stephen, Bonzo, Daniel returned to the streets of Glasgow. He didn't make an announcement or bring an army. He simply walked through the heart of Possil, dressed plainly, flanked by no one. It was a quiet reappearance, but to those who understood the underworld, it was deafening. Bonzo was not only alive, he was fearless. But beneath the calm surface, things had changed. His empire had eroded. His most trusted men were either behind bars dead or had switched sides to protect themselves. The Daniel name still carried weight, but it no longer guaranteed loyalty. Bonzo had come back to a kingdom he no longer fully controlled. In the months following his return, the violence escalated. Gunshots rang out in areas once considered off-limits. A cafe in Springburn was riddled with bullets in broad daylight. A known Lyons associate was found tied to a lamppost, beaten and humiliated. Bonzo wasn't behind every act, but his presence emboldened those still loyal to him. His return had reignited the fire. The police, overwhelmed and increasingly aggressive, launched a full-scale operation aimed at dismantling both the Daniel and Lyons networks. Raids swept through housing estates. Surveillance was increased. Arrests were made. But Bonzo remained untouched. He had learned from the past. No phones, no direct contact, no digital footprint. He moved like a man preparing for something final. The quiet meetings he held were rare and only with people he had known since childhood. But even then, Betrayal was inevitable. One of those trusted allies, Liam Spiggs McAllister, had been secretly working with organized crime investigators for over 6 months. Facing a long sentence on drug charges, Spiggs had agreed to turn over everything he knew in exchange for a lighter deal and witness protection. Bonzo's movements, his locations, even planned hits, all of it was fed directly to the authorities without him knowing. The final blow came on a rainy October night. Acting on Spiggs' information, armed officers surrounded a converted warehouse on the edge of Drumchapel. Inside, Bonzo had been preparing for a last major move, a coordinated strike on 3 Lyons properties that would have crippled their operation in one night. He never got the chance to see it through. The raid was swift and clinical. Bonzo, caught off guard, was arrested without resistance. No dramatic chase, no shootout, just silence and steel. It was over. The arrest marked the end of an era in Glasgow's gangland history. With Bonzo in custody, what remained of the Daniel Empire crumbled. The Lyons, though still active, faced their own collapse. Eddie Lyons was shot dead outside a cafe in Paisley weeks after Bonzo's arrest. The shooter never identified. Declan Lyons vanished soon after, last seen boarding a ferry to Northern Ireland. Calvin Muir's body was found floating in a canal near Falkirk, his hands bound, the murders still unsolved. The war that had torn through Glasgow for years didn't end with a bang but with slow, quiet disappearances. Bonzo never gave a statement, never named names, and never confessed. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole on charges ranging from conspiracy to murder to drug trafficking. He sat in the courtroom with the same unreadable expression he had worn through his rise and fall. No family attended. No emotion showed. He entered prison the same way he had ruled the streets, silent and untouchable. Today, Bonzo remains behind bars. The city he once controlled is still healing, the scars of the gang war etched into walls and memories. Glasgow hasn't forgotten. In some corners, his name is still spoken in fear, not because of what he did, but because of what he nearly became. A ghost king who ruled without being seen and fell without making a sound.